February 1944. The Anzio beachhead, Italy. A wounded American soldier from the 45th Infantry Division opens his eyes. The world is pain, and the voices are German. He's on a surgical table, surrounded by enemy uniforms. A German surgeon looks down, his expression unreadable. For the captured American, there is no doubt. This is not a rescue. This is the end. He is completely at their mercy. The surgeon raises a scalpel, the steel glinting under a bare bulb. The soldier braces himself, but the cut he is about to receive is not the one he expects. The life-saving surgery that followed was not an isolated act. It was part of a documented, yet deeply paradoxical medical event. A German field hospital, itself under fire and desperately short on supplies, was using its precious resources to treat enemy prisoners. This forces a central question. Was this a singular act of compassion, a calculated military decision, or a forgotten code of conduct being tested in the crucible of total war? To understand this paradox, we must first understand the hellscape where it happened. The Anzio beachhead was not just a battlefield, it was a trap. The Allied landing was meant to be a masterpiece of maneuver, a dagger thrust into the soft underbelly of German-occupied Italy. Instead, it had bogged down into a bloody, static war of attrition. By mid-February 1944, the German 14th Army, under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, was ready to spring its own trap. The code name was Operation Fischfang, fish trap. The objective was simple and brutal: drive the Allies back into the sea. As German tanks and infantry clawed back territory, a parallel war was being fought just out of sight, a war against death itself. The German medical units, the Sanitätskompanien, were overwhelmed. They operated not in sterile hospitals, but in the cellars of bombed-out farmhouses and damp, hastily fortified caves. Their greatest enemy wasn't just the wounds. It was the relentless, overwhelming power of Allied artillery. Day and night, shells from land and sea hammered their positions, turning every aid station into a potential tomb. Inside these makeshift clinics, the scarcity was absolute. For a German surgeon, the American ability to deliver blood plasma to the front was a logistical miracle, almost science fiction. His reality was a dwindling stock of sulfa powder, carefully rationed morphine, and the constant, desperate need to sterilize and reuse bandages. Every resource was calculated. Every minute of a surgeon's time was a commodity more precious than gold, measured against the life of the next German soldier waiting in line. They were fighting a two-front war, one against the injuries of their own men, and another against the sheer, crushing weight of Allied industrial might. In this environment of extreme desperation, the last thing any German doctor needed was more wounded men. But Operation Fischfang was about to bring them exactly that. The primary assault of Operation Fischfang smashed into the American perimeter on February 16th. The fighting for a brickworks complex the G's called the Factory was ferocious, a desperate struggle in muddy gullies and shattered buildings. German grenadiers overran forward positions held by the 45th and 3rd Infantry Divisions. For the surviving Americans, cornered and low on ammunition, surrender was a terrifying prospect. They braced for a summary execution or to be left to die. But then, something happened that defied the brutal logic of the battlefield. Through the smoke, German medics, Sanitäter, began moving among the captured G1s. They systematically performed battlefield triage, separating the wounded Americans from the able-bodied. The healthy were marched off to POW cages, but the wounded were carefully loaded onto German ambulances, driven not to a prison, but directly to a Hauptverbandsplatz, a main dressing station behind the lines. The German aid station was not a building. It was a wound in the earth, a series of interconnected cellars beneath a shattered Italian farmhouse. The air, thick with the smell of damp soil, antiseptic and blood, was lit by the unsteady yellow glow of carbide lamps and captured American flashlights. Wounded men, dozens of them, covered the dirt floor. Their uniforms were different, field gray and olive drab, but their groans spoke a universal language. Presiding over this chaos was the chief surgeon, a figure identified in some records as a man like Dr. Heinrich Neumann of the 90th Panzergrenadier Division's medical staff. He was not a savior, he was a gatekeeper, and he enforced a single, inviolable law. It wasn't the Geneva Convention, which few soldiers on the front lines had ever read. It was the law of the scalpel. Triage was based on one thing only: the severity of the wound. The rule was demonstrated with brutal efficiency. A German NCO, his arm peppered with shrapnel, is directed to a corner by a medic. He protests, pointing to his uniform, to his rank. The medic just shakes his head and points. On the sole operating table, a reinforced wooden door laid across two wine barrels, lies a new arrival. He's an American GI, his abdomen torn open by a shell fragment. The surgeon is already at work, clamping arteries, his movements precise and economical. The German soldier would get his turn. The American had to go first, or he wouldn't get a turn at all. For the German medical staff, this was not a moment of shared humanity. It was a professional crisis. Their reality is captured in the stark entries of Sanitätsabteilung journals and the weary post-war memoirs of doctors who served there. The influx of enemy wounded was a logistical nightmare. One German surgeon later wrote of the feeling, "Another 20 Americans arrive. We have sulfa powder for perhaps half. The same for the morphine. We are saving the enemy while our own boys are still fighting in the mud just kilometers away." This wasn't a philosophical debate. It was a mathematical problem. Every dose of anesthetic, every sterile bandage, every minute of the surgeon's time given to an American was one less available for a German. They were trapped between their oath as doctors and their duty as soldiers. The result was a grim democracy of scarcity. An American private with a shattered femur lay on a stretcher next to a German grenadier with a sucking chest wound. Both received the exact same level of care, which by Allied standards was terrifyingly primitive. There was no blood plasma. Shock was fought with a simple saline solution, often administered cold. Surgery was an act of brutal pragmatism, what the Germans called Wundversorgung, wound management. The goal wasn't reconstruction, it was stabilization. Stop the bleeding, remove dead tissue and foreign objects, and close the wound just enough to prevent infection, long enough for the patient to be evacuated to a rear area hospital. Both the American and the German received the same limited dose of morphine, enough to dull the sharpest edges of agony, but never enough to grant the mercy of oblivion. This wasn't a hospital. It was a human repair shop on a failing assembly line, run by exhausted men who had forgotten what day it was. For the captured G's lying in the gloom, fear was the first reaction. They had been told stories of German cruelty. They watched the surgeons with suspicion, convinced the care was a trick, a prelude to a brutal interrogation, or that they were being used for monstrous medical experiments. But then, they kept watching. They saw a German officer with a head wound being calmly told to wait his turn behind an American corporal. They saw the same thin soup and meager ration of bread being given to every man, regardless of his uniform. Slowly, over hours that stretched into a day, suspicion gave way to a stunned, grudging respect. They weren't being treated as enemies, or as prisoners. They were being treated as patients. The care was rough, the conditions appalling, but it was undeniably real. The enemy they were trying to kill just hours ago was now working desperately to save their lives. This scene of medical neutrality, performed under artillery fire in a collapsing cellar, seems almost impossible. It defies the simple narratives of good versus evil that we build around war. It forces a larger question. Was this the rogue action of one exceptionally humane doctor, clinging to his oath against all odds? Or was it something else, a policy, sanctioned from above, for reasons that had nothing to do with compassion? The answer was not found in one doctor's conscience, but in the cold calculations of the German High Command. This policy of medical neutrality was a ghost on the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht's war was one of systematic annihilation. But in the West, a fragile adherence to the Geneva Convention still existed within the professional officer and medical corps. And this was reinforced by cold military pragmatism. German intelligence argued that humane treatment of prisoners could weaken Allied resolve, encouraging surrenders. It was also a potent weapon against Allied propaganda depicting German barbarism. This wasn't an act of pure compassion. It was a calculated policy where a doctor's oath and a general's strategy happened to align. The German command had its reasons. The doctors had their code. But at Anzio, no policy, no matter how calculated, could prepare them for what was coming next. Inside the cellar, the rhythmic thunder of incoming shells grew from a distant rumble to a sharp, tearing shriek. The Allied barrage was walking its way toward them. Suddenly, a direct hit. The world became a concussive roar, a blinding cloud of dust and pulverized stone as the farmhouse collapsed on top of them. For a terrifying moment, there was only darkness and the crushing weight of the earth. German medics, German wounded, American prisoners, all were now just men, trapped together, united by the primal fear of being buried alive. Then, through the choking gloom, a single beam of light sliced the darkness. It came from a hand-cranked dynamo flashlight. The surgeon was already on his feet. He moved deliberately through the rubble, his light pausing on one figure, then another. The triage of the operating table was gone. Now it was the triage of the tomb. He wasn't checking uniforms. He was checking who was closest, who was still breathing, who was dying fastest. In that moment, sealed in the earth, the battle lines outside were erased by the shared, desperate struggle for one more breath. In the end, the question from the very beginning remains: why were they treated? The answer is not a single act of compassion, but a rare, fragile alignment of a doctor's professional oath, the fading influence of the Geneva Convention in the West, and the cold, pragmatic calculations of the German 14th Army. The outcome, however, was not pragmatic. It was profoundly human. Post-war POW records and veteran testimonies confirm it. Dozens of American soldiers, critically wounded, survived the war specifically because of the care they received in that cellar. This single aid station did not change the outcome of the Battle of Anzio, but it stands as a documented reminder that even within the moral catastrophe of total war, professional codes and individual choices could create small, vital pockets of humanity, complicating the stories we tell ourselves about the enemy. For a few brief days on that bloody shore, in a cellar buried by the chaos of battle, a difficult truth emerged. The laws of medicine proved stronger than the laws of war.